Hello and welcome back everybody, Levi here, and in today's video I got a pretty unique and definitely a little bit difficult commander to build around. It's Myojin of Cryptic Dreams, mono blue commander, 5 blue, so 8 mana. He's a big boy, 3/3 spirit. It says Myojin of Cryptic Dreams enters the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it if you cast it from your hand, and then you remove the indestructible counter from it to copy target permanent spell you control 3 times. So there's a lot to unpack with Myojin of Cryptic Dreams. The very first thing is we don't get the indestructible counter when we cast it from the command zone. So there's 2 scenarios we have to do here. We either have to cast it from the command zone, bounce it back to our hand, then cast it again, which is not exactly the ideal way. However, it is an option if we need it. However, the preferred way we want to do it is to bring our commander out of the command zone straight into our hand with some effects that we have in the deck, like Campfire, 1 mana artifact. The important part is you pay 2, tap it, exile it, and then you put all commanders you own from the command zone and from your graveyard into your hand, and you shuffle your graveyard into your library. This is one of 2 ways in the deck that we can get our commander into our hand from the command zone. The other one's going to be Command Beacon. It's a land, taps for colorless. You tap it, sacrifice it, and you put your commander into your hand from the command zone. Now, since these are the only 2 ways that we can get our commander into our hand, I also threw some cards into the deck to help us go find those, like Expedition Map, 1 mana artifact, pay 2, tap it, sack it, search your library for any land card, put it in your hand, then shuffle. That can go get our Command Beacon. Similarly, I also have some lands that can go search out our Command Beacon, like Teleria West. Enters the battlefield, taps for blue, but that doesn't really matter because that's really not what we're going to be using it for. It also has Transmute 1 blue, meaning we can discard this to go grab a mana value 0 card out of our library. In this case, going to be Command Beacon, and then you put it in your hand. Then we got a somewhat new one out of Mono Horizons 3, Urza's Cave. It's land, taps for colorless, pay 3, tap it, sack it, search your library for a land card, put on the battlefield, tapped, then shuffle. This one's a little bit better than the Teleria West because this one goes straight into play, so you don't actually have to miss one of your land drops to play the Command Beacon, and then, obviously it's sacrificing itself, so you're going to be down a land. Not the biggest deal in the world if that happens, but those are just some of the options. I also threw in Trinket Mage as a way to go get our Campfire if we need. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard. When Trinket Mage enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card with CMC 1 or less, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. So essentially we have 6 ways in the deck to be able to get our commander into our hand from the command zone. However, if we happen to not draw any of those cards, there is still a way that our deck can function. Like I said, cast it, bounce it back to your hand, recast it. I threw in a ton of ramp into this deck, so I really don't think having the mana is going to be an issue. So we went through all the steps, got our Myojin into our hand, cast it. Now it has an indestructible counter on it. That's a lot of hoops to jump through just to get copy target permanent spell 3 times. We want to be able to use that ability way more than once. We basically never want our commander to not have one of those indestructible counters on it. So the way to do it is proliferate. We have to proliferate those counters and basically never use the last one, or else you can't proliferate again. Then you have to bounce it back to your hand and recast it, like I said earlier. So I'll just go over some of the best proliferate in the deck. Dreamtide Whale up first, 2 and a blue, 7/5 whale, vanishing 2, which will never matter because you're proliferating, so you'll always be able to up those vanishing counters. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you proliferate, so it counts you and your opponents. Flux Channeler up next, 2 and a blue, 2/2 human wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you proliferate. We do have a lot of creatures in the deck, but we also have a lot of non-creatures, so this should be triggering all the time. Definitely the best proliferate spell in the deck, which is now luckily down to almost budget range, I'd say. Inexorable Tide, it's down to about $4 currently. 3 blue enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. So this one, unlike the Flux Channeler, this one also counts your creature spells. Last one I want to talk about here, Kiora's Dam Breaker, 5 and a blue for a 5/6 Leviathan, and it just says when it enters the battlefield, you proliferate. So just as an example, as a floor for Kiora's Dam Breaker, say we already have 2 indestructible counters on our commander. We've proliferated with some other effect. We have 2 on there. Cast the Kiora's Dam Breaker for 6, remove one of the counters, you copy it 3 times. So you have 4 Kiora's Dam Breakers entering the battlefield. You proliferate 4 times, bringing your commander up to a total of 5 indestructible counters. You also have 4 5/6 Leviathans that you can either attack or block with, and then the next spell you cast, you can copy it 12 times because you don't want to remove the last one. You could copy it 15 times, but you don't want to remove the last one. You always want to keep that one so you can keep proliferating. So that's just an example of some of the crazy things you can do in this deck. But now we've got our commander onto the battlefield. We're proliferating all the counters. What are we actually going to be copying to make all of this effort worth it? Well, that's going to be the value category. Of all the things in the deck, this is definitely the most interchangeable. There's so many things that you can copy with this. I thought enchantments were probably some of the best things that you can copy because there's not a lot of other ways to copy enchantments. Blue has a lot of copy effects, a lot of clone effects, but most of them only hit creatures. Obviously, I threw in some creatures in the deck to copy, but I thought since it's not very easy to copy enchantments in other decks, it'd be a really cool way to take this one. So some of the cool enchantments I threw in here, As Foretold up first, 2 and a blue enchantment at the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on As Foretold, and then once each turn you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast with mana value X or less, where X is the number of time counters on As Foretold. Now this card is good on its own. If you just have 1 copy of it, still really good. However, if you copy it with your commander, say we now have 4 copies, you use your proliferate effects to bump up the number of time counters on your as foretold. Only have to do that a couple of times. You wait for the upkeep a couple of times. Now you're casting pretty much everything in your deck for free, and that's just with one indestructible counter from our commander. If we use like 2, 3, 4, something like that, you don't really need to be doing that because you're probably going to hit a ceiling at some point. You're not going to have as many cards to cast for free, so probably just keep it at the 4 total, and then you pretty much can cast whatever you want for free. Another really cool one, extravagant replication for blue for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of another target non-land permanent you control. Say you make 3 copies of the replication, now you have 4, so each one of your upkeeps, you create 4 copies of a non-land permanent. Pretty much for every card in this category, it obviously gets out of hand the more copies you have. So if you have extra indestructible counters, use it for the extravagant replication and then go nuts after that. I thought a pretty funny win con in the deck would be Forced Fruition for blue enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player draws 7 cards. So normally I wouldn't just throw this into any old deck. However, if we have, 4, 7, 10 copies of this thing, then whenever any of our opponents play any spell, they're drawing like 30, 40, 50, whatever, how many cards, they're going to deck themselves really quickly. This is one of those cards that's definitely worth all of the investment into our commander to then get extra copies of and pretty much just lock our opponents out of the game. Definitely not the most fun card, but it is an option if you wanted to go more down that route. Another pretty ridiculous one here, Kappa Cannoneer, 5 and a blue for a 4/4 artifact creature turtle warrior with improvise and ward 4. Says whenever Kappa Cannoneer or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer and it can't be blocked this turn. Again, the floor with this one, you remove 1 indestructible counter from your commander, you make 4 copies of Kappa Cannoneer, they all see each other, they all become 8/8s with ward 4, they can't be blocked, so you don't have haste, but next turn, cast another artifact or something like that. These just get huge out of hand really quickly, and they can be unblockable if you have a lot of artifacts, which I do in the deck. I have a lot of mana rocks specifically. These can definitely help you close out the game. Another kind of mean one, but I really like it in this deck, Kaiga the Tidestar, 5 and a blue for a 5/5 dragon spirit with flying. It says when Kaiga the Tidestar dies, you gain control of target creature. Normally, obviously, legendary creatures are not really going to be working in this deck, but when they have dice triggers like Kaiga does, you just remove one of those counters from your commander, make 4 copies of this, 3 of them will die, you take the 3 best creatures from your opponents, and that's permanently too. You don't have to give them back. Just a cool little value piece here, Master of Waves, 3 and a blue for a 2/1 merfolk wizard with protection from red. Says elemental creatures you control get +1/+1, and when Master of Waves enters the battlefield, create a number of 1/0 blue elemental creature tokens equal to your devotion to blue. Considering we're in mono blue, I have a feeling that's going to be pretty high, especially if we have our commander out. That's already 3 pips off our commander and then 1 off the Master of Waves. However, if we copy the Master of Waves 3 times and you have 4 copies of it, let's say there's nothing else on the field but your commander and the Master of Waves, the 4 copies obviously. Each Master of Waves is going to enter, create 7 of those 1/0 blue elemental creature tokens, and then they all get +4/+4 because you have 4 copies of Master of Waves. Now you have 28 5/4s, and obviously it gets crazier the more counters you remove from your commander. This is just a ridiculous card. If you can get, 2 or 3, 4 indestructible counters off your commander, definitely flood the board with a bunch of elementals and close out the game really quickly with that one, no doubt. Next up, I thought Nerd Rage would be a pretty funny include in here. 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura enchant creature. When it ETBs, you draw 2 cards. That's great off the rip. Also, enchanted creature has, you have no maximum hand size, and whenever this creature attacks, if you have 10 or more cards in hand, it gets +10/+10 until end of turn. So if we remove the counter and copy this 3 times with our commander, it's almost guaranteed we're going to have that 10 cards in hand because the copies and the original are going to be drawing us 8 cards on their own. You throw this on, say, your Thrumming Bird or something with flying, and then when the Thrumming Bird attacks, it's going to get like +40/+40 until end of turn. So that's just a one-shot for your opponents. Just some of the stuff you could do in this deck is ridiculous. The more I talk about this deck, the more I want to put it together. This seems so ridiculous. Obviously, there's a lot of hoops to jump through, but giving your Thrumming Bird +40/+40 because it has 4 Nerd Rages on it, you can't not love that. Similar to the As Foretold, I also threw in 1 with the Multiverse, 6 blue for an enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, and then once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from your hand or the top of your library without paying its mana cost. So just another great value piece to be able to help us cast other spells for free. And obviously, the more copies we have, the more spells that we're allowed to cast for free, because you get to cast 1 for each copy of one with the Multiverse that you have. Last one I'm talking about here, Storm of Saruman, 4 blue enchantment ward 3. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it, except the copy isn't legendary. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is one of the only effects I threw in here besides our commander that actually copies spells. So you can think of Storm of Saruman as kind of like a little backup for your commander. Real quick, I'll go over some of the ramp in the deck. Obviously, when you're playing a Proliferate theme, throw in cards like Astral Cornucopia, XXX artifact. It says it enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it. Tap it, choose a color, add 1 mana of that color for each charge counter on Astral Cornucopia. Obviously, you can dump a bunch of mana into this right away to get a bunch of counters on it, or you could just cast it for 3 mana, get 1 charge counter on it, and then proliferate those those counters, which can really help us speed up the game, get our commander out a little bit faster. Similarly to that one, I have Empowered Auto Generator. 4 mana artifact, enters the battlefield tapped. You tap it, you put a charge counter on it, and then you add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of charge counters on it. This one you don't really have the option to dump a bunch of mana into, but it's cool that it continues to put charge counters on itself as the game goes on. Another interesting one, Pyramid of the Pantheon. 1 mana artifact, pay 2, tap it, add 1 mana of any color. Then you put a brick counter on Pyramid of the Pantheon. Then you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color, but only if you have 3 or more brick counters on Pyramid of the Pantheon. So similar to the other ones, you pay 3 mana total, and then you proliferate that twice. Now this is tapping for 3 mana every turn. Last one I'm talking about here, Replicating Ring. 3 mana snow artifact, tap to add 1 mana of any color, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a night counter on Replicating Ring. Then if it has 8 or more night counters on it, you remove all of them and create 8 copies of Replicating Ring. So really, when it comes to our ramp package, at least for these cards, the Proliferate is definitely what gets our entire deck kind of running smoothly. So I only have about like 9 Proliferate cards in the deck. You probably even want to add more than that, because it kind of just makes our whole strategy, you know, a little bit smoother, helps us get our commander out faster, things like that. Next up, the draw category. Prophet of the Scarab up first. 4 and a blue for a 3/4 zombie wizard with vigilance. It says when this creature enters, draw cards equal to the number of zombies you control or the number of zombie cards in your graveyard, whichever is greater. Later in the game, once your hand's a little empty, cast the Prophet of the Scarab, remove a counter from your commander, make 4 total copies of Prophet of the Scarab. What it does, they all enter at the same time. It says, okay, you have 4 zombies. Draw 4 cards for each Prophet of the Scarab that you have, thus drawing you like 16 cards, possibly even more, depending on how many counters you're going to remove from your commander. This can absolutely help you draw a ton of cards. Another really cool one, Thopter Spy Network. 2 blue enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. Also, whenever 1 or more artifact creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So you could just cast this on its own before you get your commander out. However, having 4 Thopter Spy Networks seems like a really good way to draw cards. If we have 4 copies of it, on our upkeep, we make 4 1/1 Thopters with flying. Then basically the next turn, you send 1 Thopter at each of your opponents, drawing you 12 cards because you have 4 Thopter Spy Networks. I also threw one in that's not exactly my typical budget range, but I just thought it's such a fun card in this deck, I had to throw it in. Scrawling Crawler. 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian Construct. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card. Then whenever an opponent draws a card, that player loses 1 life. Not much explanation needed here. If you have 4 copies of Scrawling Crawler, whenever an opponent draws a card, they're going to be losing 4 life. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, each player is going to be drawing 4 cards. That means with 1 use from our commander and the Scrawling Crawler, each of our opponents are going to be taking 16 damage on our upkeep because we're going to be drawing 4 cards. And each of the Scrawling Crawlers triggers individually, so your opponents will be losing 4 per crawler, which is 16 total. Next up, just a couple of removal spells to talk about here. I threw in Lux Cannon. 4 mana artifact. It says tap, put a charge counter on Lux Cannon, or tap it to remove 3 charge counters from Lux Cannon, destroy target permanent. Obviously, this goes very well in a Proliferate deck. Not really much to talk about there. Also threw in Meteor Golem since we can make copies of it with our commander. 7 mana, 3/3 artifact creature Golem. When this creature enters, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. Obviously, I threw in the standard removal into this deck, but I also threw in cards like the Meteor Golem to help take advantage of our commander's ability if we need to. Then obviously, like I was talking about at the beginning, a lot of our removal is in the form of bounce, just in case we need to bounce our commander back to our hand to reset the indestructible counter. Some of the better ones like Call to Heal. 1 and a blue for an instant, return target creature to its owner's hand, its controller draws a card. So not only are we bouncing our commander back to our hand, we're also getting a card draw off of it. That one's not too bad at all. But if we end up having to use it on our opponents, that's also fine as well. Last but not least, just a couple of cards to talk about in the utility category. First up, Adric Mathematical Genius. 1 and a blue for a 1/1 human artificer. It says pay 2 and a blue, tap it, copy target activated or triggered ability you control, and you may choose new targets for the copy. Basically, this lets us pay a little bit of extra mana and not have to remove as many counters from our commander if we need to. Similarly, I threw in cards like Rings of Bright Hearth. 3 mana artifact. Whenever you activate an ability, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 2. If you do, you copy it, and then you may choose new targets for the copy. Cool thing about Rings of Bright Hearth, if you happen to be removing more than 1 indestructible counter from your commander, you can pay 2 for each one that you remove to copy it that many times. Last one I'm talking about here, Dour Port-mage. 1 in the blue, 1/3 frog wizard. Whenever 1 or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, you draw a card. So if we happen to bounce our commander back to our hand, we draw a card. That's nice on its own, but it also says pay 1 and a blue, tap it, return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. Obviously, like I said, bounce our commander back to our hand to recast it to get the counter again, or we can also use that to save some of our other creatures if they happen to be getting removed. You just pay 1 in the blue, bounce it back to your hand. Also, this is a really good way that we can bounce a card back to our hand, cast it, and then use our commander's ability on it again. Say you played your Master of Waves already, you've proliferated a couple more times, now you have a couple more counters on your commander, remove all of them except for 1, recast your Master of Waves, definitely winning after that unless your opponents have a board wipe or something. So Dour Port-mage has a ton of different uses in this deck. But that is pretty much it for my Myojin of Cryptic Dreams deck. I kind of just made this one off of a whim because it seemed like a really fun idea, but I didn't think I would like it this much. So all of the crazy things that you can end up doing with this deck, obviously, yes, it is pretty janky. You have to get your commander into your hand and then cast it. However, once you do that, you're off to the races. And I'm saying you can get some crazy value like I talked about in this deck for honestly not that much work. If you ramp every turn basically up until you can cast your commander, I have like 15 ramp spells in this deck. So it's possible you can get your commander out a couple turns early before your opponents can really even do anything about it. Not to mention the indestructible counter isn't just a counter. It also gives your commander indestructible. So it's really hard to deal with your commander once he's out. Your opponents will have to exile him or some other way, bounce him or something like that. This is one that I might actually end up putting together in paper. I don't have a mono blue deck yet, and I make a lot of them for the channel. So this might be one that I actually put together in paper. We'll see. Time will tell. But I have the full deck list down in the description. Go ahead and click that Architect link. You might notice I left the deck size over 100. That's kind of how I've been building my commander decks for my channel lately, leaving a couple cards over so that if you don't like a certain card, you can take it out, you know, kind of modify the deck to your liking. But also down in the description, I have a link to my Patreon. There's a little intro video talking about the different perks you get for subscribing to my channel, such as like personalized deck text, things like that. But really, that's all I've got for this video, everybody. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.